to escape from this problem by alleging Joshua wrote the last part of Deuteronomy. Unfortunately for them, this would mean that Joshua also wrote Deuteronomy 34:9, which says, Joshua, the son of Nun, was full of the spirit of wisdom. Well, it's difficult to see how Joshua could have written this in light of the fact that if he was full of the spirit of wisdom, he certainly wasn't full of the spirit of modesty. Moreover, by attributing the final verses of Deuteronomy to Joshua, apologists are admitting that Moses did not write some of the Torah. While addressing this issue, on page 22 in his book entitled Answers to Tough Questions, apologist Josh McDowell says, quote, though Orthodox Jews and Christians alike argue that Moses wrote 5 Old Testament, some people deny his authorship of the 5th book, Deuteronomy. They do this partly on the grounds that chapter 34 contains the account of Moses' death. Since no one can write an account of his own death, they argue, doesn't this mean the book of Deuteronomy had to have been written later in the time of Moses? A plausible explanation, is to assume that it was written by Joshua after the death of Moses. Unquote, McDowell. McDowell conveniently fails to provide so much as a shred of evidence to prove Joshua was the author. Following this kind of rationale, one could just as easily attribute it to Eleazar, Aaron's son, or Achan, a contemporary of Joshua, or any one of a number of other post-Mosaic individuals. Another evangelical who is also willing to admit that Moses did not write the last chapter of Deuteronomy is Gleason Archer, who says on page 263 of his book entitled A Survey of the Old Testament, an Introduction, quote, only chapter 34 is demonstrably post-Mosaic, since it contains a short account of the death of Moses, unquote. So 2 major apologists, Archer and McDowell, are willing to admit that Moses didn't write some of the Torah. Other evidence could be presented, but the point has been made. The evidence is overwhelming that Moses didn't write the Pentateuch, regardless of what Jesus, Paul, Joshua, or the Sadducees may say to the contrary. Defenders of the Bible are on the horns of a dilemma. If they succumb to the facts and concede that Moses couldn't have written the Pentateuch, they bring the truthfulness and divinity of Jesus into question. If, on the other hand, they decide to man the barricades at all costs by conceding nothing, they are fighting a battle that can only result in their defeat and further erode their credibility. The most determined biblicist concede that there is no way Moses could have written the Torah. McDowell is one of the staunchest apologists, one of today's staunchest apologists. Yet he made the following inadvertent admission on page 21 of his book entitled Answers to Tough Questions. Quote, in the past 50 years, archaeological finds have vindicated many of the Old Testament claims supporting the probability of Mosaic authorship. Notice he qualifies his comment with the word probability. He didn't say certainty. He said probability. In other words, he's guessing. Besides the fact that data strongly demonstrates there's no possible way Moses could have written the Pentateuch, the lack of evidence for his existence tends to prove that he never lived to begin with. Even some fundamentalist scholars don't deny that Moses could very well be a mythological figure. On page 9 in his work entitled Biblical Criticism, apologist R.K. Harrison states, quote, the main problem faced by historical criticism in this and other areas seems to be a lack of contemporary objective data associated with specific biblical personages and events. This situation is particularly acute in the case of Moses, for whom no secular corroborative information is extant. In other words, there's no data outside the Bible to prove Moses was ever a real person. As far as external evidence is concerned, the historical existence of Moses is all but impossible to prove. We'd like to conclude today by reading a letter from a biblicist in Dayton, Ohio. He states, quote, "I pray and hope that there will be more biblical errancy programs in the future. Your programs are definitely what should be taught during Wednesday evening and Sunday morning Bible classes. I believe that the information you present may get many upset, but don't let their words upset you. Isaiah 51:7 and Luke 6:22 explain that we should not fear the reproach of men, neither be afraid of their revilings or abuse." Then he quotes Scripture. "Blessed are ye when men shall hate you, and when they shall separate you from their company, and shall reproach you, and shall cast out your name as evil. May peace be upon you." Unquote. In reply, I said, "Thank you for your support. You're living proof that some biblicists not only watch our TV programs, but definitely feel they are needed. Putting on TV programs that expose the Bible is not a useless activity as by any means, as some have implied. I occasionally hear freethinkers assert that talking to biblicists is a waste of time because, quote, "you can't change those people." I've never agreed with that contention and never will. As I've said before on many occasions, I've never been to an atheist, agnostic, or humanist meeting in my life in which nearly all of the participants didn't come out of some sort of religious background. And if they can make it over the wall, so can others. That completes our presentation. And please join us later for the 76th edition of Biblical Errancy Commentary, when we'll continue showing why the Bible is nothing more than the flawed composition of some fallible human beings. Thank you for listening.